I was indifferent to the Russian invasion of Ukraine at first. It's war. It shouldn't happen, but it does. It didn't sit right with me that it was the US in charge of the international response to Russia advancing its troops into Ukrainian territory. I suppose I'd have felt different about it if it were another country with a history of being neutral during times of war. Sweden, for instance, was neutral in both world wars and until date is not a member state of NATO. Or an African country like Rwanda that has risen from the ashes of tribal genocides fueled on by Western powers.
I want that, I need that, that's real, homie, I can't believe that.
Russia's military campaign inside Ukrainian borders and the US leading the globe in criticizing the move is reminiscent of the Cold War. My expectation was that propaganda would be traded and the truth of what was really going on would be the first casualty of war. I haven't been wrong on that point so far. I also noticed that other countries were quite hesitant in ostracizing Russia from the international community. It wasn't that they were defending Russia's raw aggression, but that the extremity of the sanctions being proposed would not only have an effect on the global economy, but the move would outright expose the hypocrisy of world leadership. As American troops were gearing up for bombardment spree on Kenya's neighbor to the east, Somalia, these were the international headlines. Yes, Russia is acting as a colonial power towards Ukraine. Kenya's United Nations speech on Ukraine praised for citing Africa's colonial legacy. So here's a key extract from that speech.
I give the floor to the permanent representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, across the border of every single African country live our countrymen with whom we share deep historical, cultural, and linguistic bonds. At independence, had we chosen to pursue states on the basis of ethnic, racial, or religious homogeneity, we would still be waging bloody wars these many decades later. Instead, we agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited, but we would still pursue continental political, economic, and legal integration. Rather than form nations that looked ever backwards into history with a dangerous nostalgia, we chose to look forward to a greatness none of our many nations and peoples had ever known. We chose to follow the rules of the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Charter, not because our borders satisfied us, but because we wanted something greater, forged in peace. We believe that all states formed from empires that have collapsed or retreated have many peoples in them yearning for integration with peoples in neighboring states. This is normal and understandable. After all, who does not want to be joined to their brethren and to make common purpose with them? Kenya rejects such a yearning from being pursued by force. We must complete our recovery from the embers of dead empires in a way that does not plunge us back into new forms of domination and oppression. We rejected irredentism and expansionism on any basis, including racial, ethnic, religious, or cultural factors. We reject it again today. Kenya registers its strong concern and opposition to the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states.
Great speech right there, wouldn't you agree? I had a rare moment of being proud to be Kenyan 1,000 miles away from home, considering how monumental the speech was in enforcing the proper moral compass to the Russo-Ukrainian war. Why did the latter part of it addressing the US for the same colonial attitudes it exhibits on the international stage not make the headlines?
We further strongly condemn the trend in the last few decades of powerful states, including members of this Security Council, breaching international law with little regard.
Your guess is as good as mine. You might also have picked up on how the US is in a terrible habit of refuting criticism while applying pressure on other countries to conform to its national interests. For decades, the US has repeatedly demanded nations get behind it in crisis times or pay the price.
You're either with us or you're with the enemy. That's clear. I will continue to make that clear.
Warned US President George W. Bush on the eve of his global war on terror, following the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington. And soon after the US designated Iran, Iraq, and North Korea the world's axis of evil and prepared to invade Iraq, it demanded that nations take its side or incur its wrath.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil. The price of indifference would be catastrophic.
The following decade, in the Obama administration years, Washington raised pressure on China and demanded of all its trading partners to get behind it or face the consequences. The Trump administration even went as far as warning members of the United Nations that it was taking names of those who voted in favor of a resolution condemning its decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So just think about it. Everything in that speech by the UNC member from Kenya could have been said of the US, and it would have been relevant. As the US is waning, China rising, Russia coming back with a vengeance, the US's coercive tone has become rather weird, tired, and desperate, prompting countries to keep their options open, making ordinary folks like me not so quick to side with the official narratives coming out of Washington or Brussels. Somewhere in the course of the war, I started seeing posts like this. I thought to myself, that was rather gutsy for anyone to share. But then the headlines began reading like this. And that was to me clear proof as any that a speech made by Kenya before the UNC was a hit job on Russia, rather than a grand reveal of how polished the African soul had emerged from under the pressure of Western colonialism. Now, who would have thought just a week after the eloquence and the clarity of the speech, the media would have been making statements like this?
With all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades, this is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
If this is choosing his words carefully, I shudder to think about his impromptu utterances. After all, by describing Ukraine as civilized, isn't he really telling us that Ukrainians, unlike Afghans and Iraqis, are more deserving of our sympathy than Iraqis or Afghans?
I'm sorry, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles.
I understand and respect the emotion.
So all the compassion in Europe and America is for the blue-eyed blondes, am I right? For someone who doesn't come from the West, it's becoming eerily clear how race relations could get in the way of law enforcement and judicial processes. So, in other words, not only do the Ukrainians look like us, even their cars look like our cars. And that trite observation is seriously being trotted out as the reason for why we should care about Ukrainians.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
As if war is always and forever an ordinary routine limited to developing third world nations.
What's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
They're too white, too middle class to be referred to as refugees. Perhaps we should scour the dictionary for a more sophisticated term to use when referring to them. We don't want to lump them together with the browns and the blacks crossing the Mediterranean on rafts, do we?
There was a op-ed today in the Telegraph. I think we have it. We'll put it up for our viewers to see. This was an op-ed in which the writer, Daniel Hannon, said that these people, the Ukrainians, they're like us. They watch Netflix. They have Instagram accounts. They read uncensored newspaper, and then goes on to say that war is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote population.
What all these petty, superficial differences from owning cars and clothes to having Netflix and Instagram accounts add up to is not real human solidarity for unoppressed people. In fact, it's the opposite. It's tribalism. These comments point to a pernicious racism that permeates today's war coverage and seeps into its fabric like a stain that won't go away. The implication is clear. War is a natural state of people of color, while white people naturally gravitate towards peace. Refugee status is synonymous with people of color. Is this the reason people of color will often get asked where they're from? Tell me why it surprises you when their English is so good. Is that the reason the consensus for making war on brown and black countries is so easily come to? Because they're not like you?
Mostly they would consider white people first. White people first, Indian people, Arabic people, before black people.
We went to the train station and they will not let us in. And when they did let us in, they were like, you have to give us money.
It is at this point of the discourse around the ongoing war that I felt I had enough skin in the game to go from apathy to caring quite a bit about it. So let's talk about this documentary, Winter on Fire, Ukraine's Fight for Freedom. 2015 documentary film about the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine from 21st November 2013 to 23rd February 2014, produced by Netflix. Winter on Fire was screened at various film festivals before its release on 9 October 2015 on Netflix. The film had its world premiere at the 72nd Venice International Film Festival. At the 2015 Toronto International Film Festival, it won the People's Choice Award for Best Documentary. The film was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature and the Primetime Emmy Award in the Exceptional Merit in Documentary Filmmaking category. It was also one of the winners of the 2016 Television Academy Honors. So you might want to go check that out. On Rotten Tomatoes, it has a rating of 88% based on 25 reviews, with an average rating of 7.5. It also has a score of 79 out of 100 on Metacritic based on 12 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. Critic Lev Golinkin, Amy Kuda, and Jay Weisberg criticized the film for showing several symbols and flags described as neo-Nazi symbols used by extreme right-wing protesters, left uncommented in the film. Golinkin was the most critical of the film. According to Golinkin, the colorful array of activists, artists, scarf-wrapped babushki, bearded priests, and fresh-faced students make it appear as if Ukraine's people from all walks of life participated in the Maidan uprising, but some are missing: neo-Nazis who are edited out.
This was the Maidan in 2014, as hundreds of thousands of people rallied and ultimately forced out an unpopular president. Russia branded it a coup, orchestrated by neo-Nazis and fascists.
The group emerged from the revolution that swept across Ukraine in 2014, and it has gotten a lot stronger amid the ongoing war with pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. At their public events, one thing that surprised me was how many Ukrainians tend to see Azov not as militants or extremists, but as war heroes.
The marching young men are far-right nationalists from the Nationalny Drużyny.
Ukraine is a multi-ethnic country that was formerly part of the Soviet Union. Here are a few statistics that could help you understand the ethnic relations in Ukraine. From 2006 to 2008, 184 attacks and 12 racially motivated murders took place. In 2009, no such murders were recorded, but 40 racial incidences of violence were reported. A 2010 poll conducted by the Kuras Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies UK showed that some 70% of Ukrainians estimated the nation's attitudes towards other ethnic minorities as conflict and tense. In 2012, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance reported that tolerance towards Jews, Russians, and Romani appears to have significantly declined in Ukraine since 2000, and prejudices are also reflected in daily life against other groups who experience problems in accessing goods and services. What do the officials have to say? Human Rights Watch reported that racism and xenophobia remain entrenched problems in Ukraine. Valery Gavgalenko argues that racism and ethnic discrimination has arguably been a large fringe issue in the past, but has had a climb in social influence due to ultra-nationalist parties gaining attention in recent years. There have been recorded incidents of violence where the victim's race is widely thought to have played a role, and these incidents receive extensive media coverage and are usually condemned by all mainstream political forces. Alexander Fieldman, president of the Association of National and Cultural Unions of Ukraine, people attacked on racial grounds do not report the incidents to the police, and the police often fail to classify such attacks as racially motivated and often write them off as domestic offense or hooliganism. This is the daily struggle of minority groups in Ukraine. It is known by both law enforcers and the local officials. It is researched and reported by international bodies. But all of this is edited out of the mainstream narrative around Ukraine, just like the neo-Nazis in the Netflix documentary Winter on Fire. Judging by the recent reports of unequal treatment for foreigners attempting to flee, we might have to confront the fact that Ukraine has a white supremacy problem. The white supremacist ideology has always existed in the Western world. And so for most of you, it might come across as something strange. But it is evident in their earlier philosophy and in their arts, and it goes all the way back to 378 BCE, looking at Plato's publication, The Republic, which depicts a society where efforts are undertaken to improve human beings through selective breeding. Later, Italian philosopher and poet Tommaso Campanella, in The City of the Sun, published in 1623, described a utopian community in which only the socially elite are allowed to procreate. British explorer Francis Galton's Hereditary Genius, published in 1869, proposed that a system of arranged marriages between men of distinction and women of wealth would eventually produce a gifted race. Galton, also a natural scientist, would later introduce the white supremacy ideology into the realm of science. He coined the term eugenics in 1883, influenced by his cousin Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. Galton advocated a system that would allow the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. In the advent of following the science, social Darwinism emerged as the popular theory of the late 19th century. It postulated that life for humans in society was ruled by survival for the fittest. And this helped advance eugenics into serious scientific study in the early 1900s. By World War I, many scientific authorities and political leaders supported eugenics. Benjamin Disraeli, hope I'm saying it right, the UK's Prime Minister then, and one of the most committed race ideologists of his time, put it, race implies difference. Difference implies superiority, and superiority leads to predominance. Following World War I, the United States gained status as a world power. A concomitant fear arose that if a healthy stock of the American people became diluted with socially undesirable traits, the country's political and economic strength would begin to crumble. The maintenance of world peace by fostering democracy, capitalism, and at times eugenic-based schemes was central to the activities of the Internationalists, a group of prominent American leaders in business, education, publishing, and government. So as you can see, during the early 1900s, eugenics became a serious scientific study pursued by both biologists and social scientists. And they sought to determine the extent to which human characteristics of social importance were inherited. Among their greatest concerns were the predictability of intelligence and certain deviant behaviors. Eugenics, however, was not confined to scientific laboratories and academic institutions. It began to pervade cultural thought throughout the globe. In the United States, the eugenics movement began during the Progressive Era and remained active through 1940. However, social Darwinism ultimately failed as a science in the 1930s and 40s when the assumption of eugenicists became heavily criticized and the Nazis used eugenics to support the extermination of entire races, which only tells me that the theory of social Darwinism and the ideology of white supremacy aren't what internationalists then or globalists today disagree with. It is the extremity to which the Nazis took it that was shocking. Otherwise, how would you explain the overwhelming support from American and European leaders for the white nationalist movement that has been fighting off the Russian minority and their elected officials in Ukraine over the last 8 years? Quoting an article by The Guardian published back in 2014, armed protesters in Maidan Square, Kiev, were seizing government buildings and demanding a change of government and constitution. US and European leaders championed the masked militants and denounced the elected government for its crackdown. America is with you, Senator John McCain told demonstrators then, standing shoulder to shoulder with the leader of the far-right Svoboda Party as the US ambassador haggled with the State Department over who would make up the new Ukrainian government. When the Ukrainian president was replaced by a US-elected administration in an entirely unconstitutional takeover, politicians such as William Hague brazenly misled Parliament about the legality of what had taken place, the imposition of a pro-Western government on Russia's most neuralgic and politically divided neighbor. Putin beat back, taking a leaf out of the US street protests playbook, even though, as in Kiev, the protests had spread from Crimea to eastern Ukraine, evidently have mass support. But what had been a glorious cry for freedom in Kiev became infiltration and insatiable aggression in Sevastopol and Luhansk. After Crimeans voted overwhelmingly to join Russia, the bulk of the Western media abandoned any hint of even-handed coverage. So Putin is now routinely compared to Hitler, while the role of the fascistic right in the streets and in the new Ukrainian regime has been airbrushed out of most reportings as Putinist propaganda. So what's the implication of that? Most of you are media trained to call the Nazi militia groups in Ukraine Russian propaganda by the same media that has, over the years, documented how these extremist groups thrive and are celebrated in Ukraine. In the previous episode, we uncovered from immigration data from various Western countries how post-Soviet Ukraine has been unbearable for minority groups like Russians and Jews, and why it was important to factor in that into how you view this whole conflict. We've watched with horror how brazenly discriminatory the Ukrainian officials have been to black and brown foreigners in the evacuation protocols.
The official literally looked me in my eye and said in his language, "Only Ukrainians, that's all. That if you are black, you should walk."
The Western media has worn its implicit racism on its sleeves for all of us to see, acting out their disbelief of white people being displaced by war like the uncivilized third world.
This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
Do you now see what this war is really about? It's about which version of the white man is best suited to survive. It's why statements like these have been made.
If Ukraine will not stand, Europe will not stand. If we will fall, you will fall.
It's about what makes the West different, superior, and predominant over Russia and those of Russian descent. It's about eugenics, minorities and foreigners being pushed to the end of the line so that the chances of survival are higher for the blue-eyed blonde refugees. It's social Darwinism on the global stage. And my respect goes to any country and any person that has wisely chosen to keep out of it. Of all the ongoing wars, this is not the one to grow a conscience for. And that is my honest take. Hey guys, thank you for tuning in to the channel and watching that episode all the way through till the end. I'm your host, Twips, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you here with me. If you enjoyed that episode, make sure to smash the like, leave a comment, hit the bell, share, and subscribe. Also, head over to our channel page to get caught up on all the content we've put out so far. More information in the description box on how you can support the channel or reach me. Be safe out there. I'll catch you in the next one.
I want that, I need that, that's real homie. I can't believe that.